And welcome everyone to another New Jersey Constitutional Republicans virtual conversation. It's my great honor tonight to welcome Dr. Diana Schaub. Thank you, Doctor, for joining us.
Thanks, I'm delighted to be here.
Now, Diana is a professor of political science at Loyola University in Maryland, and she received both her MA and PhD from the University of Chicago. She teaches and writes on a wide range of issues in political philosophy and American political thought. She is a non-resident senior fellow of AEI, American Enterprise Institute, and she is a good friend of NJCR's good friend, Dr. Robbie George, who leads the James Madison program on American institutions and ideals at Princeton University. And she gave a lecture in 2019 entitled, quote, Lincoln and Washington Statements of Racial Reconciliation, unquote. These are 3 lectures on the James Madison program, and we will be providing a link to this and some of the other videos that she has put up. And Dr. George and Diana also both served on President Bush's and Obama's Commission on Bioethics, which is a very, very distinguished and important role that they were both a part of. And of course, we followed the debate on bioethics, and it was great to have them both on that presidential commission. Unfortunately, it was discontinued in the last administration. Diana wrote an article in the New Atlantis magazine called The Invention of Slavery, Lincoln on Whether Technology Makes Us Free based on Lincoln's speech, Inventions and Discoveries he gave in 1859, and a YouTube video that we will provide the link to exists with Diana doing this lecture. And in 2009, Dr. Schaub also published an academic study entitled, quote, Of Believers and Barbarians, Montesquieu's Enlightened Toleration, which is an extraordinary work. And I'm excited about reading it. And we're also planning on having Diana back to discuss topics and important men like Frederick Douglass, who was a hero to the Constitutional Republicans, and Booker T. Washington. So we're going to be encouraged and excited about that. And Diana, has various essays on the Claremont Review of Books website. And of course, Claremont is a great resource for all constitutional Republicans. And she has many articles on the website. We will provide a link to that. And she has many videos on YouTube. So type in Dr. Diana Schaub and you'll see her on YouTube with some outstanding videos, and we will continue to list them. And today, Diana, we had you and Mr. Crystal on, which really, I believe, was a precursor to this book, who we are highlighting tonight and very excited to share with the public. And that is your book entitled His Greatest Speeches, How Lincoln Moved the Nation.
Right.
And there's the book. I wanted to bring it up too. I did have it up too. I'm not quite sure what happened to it. Let's see. I guess it's not there anymore.
That's
but
all right.
Diana, you do have, yeah, you have it up. Very good. There it is. And we will provide the link to where you can purchase this outstanding book on Amazon. So we will have the link with the video after we get done our conversation. So Diana, my intro for you, I think, was the Gettysburg Address ×4 in the number of words used.
That's right. The Gettysburg Address is 272 words. You could say the whole thing in about 3 minutes.
It's truly remarkable, and we're going to get to the Gettysburg Address because Diana's book, His Greatest Speeches, How Lincoln Moved the Nation, is an examination of 3 speeches, beginning with the Lyceum Address, 1787, and Reverence for the Constitution and Laws. That is chapter 1. And this speech, Diana, was given when Lincoln was 28 years old in 1838. And the speech is actually entitled the perpetuation of our political institutions. Now, Diana, the relevance this speech has for us today is astonishing. And beginning with Lincoln's assertion the United States could never be conquered by a foreign foe, but rather it would reach its demise from within by democratic dysfunction, tolerance for lawlessness, eroding the people's trust in government, leading to an opening for a demagogic populist. Please expand upon that, if you will.
Yeah. Lincoln looked around in 1838 and he saw these various outbreaks of mob rule. And he says these outbreaks were happening across the land. It wasn't specific to the slaveholding states or the non-slaveholding states. So he noted this growing disregard for the law, and he explained what that trajectory would lead to. It's a very detailed analysis. It proceeds step by step. But his ultimate claim is that this growing disregard for the law will lead to an alienation on the part of the people towards their government. And when that alienation reaches a certain point, people will give up on the project of self-government. And he says, especially the best citizens will be inclined to do this because they want security and tranquility. They want what law and due process can bring them. So he is worried that it might even be the very best citizens who would give up on self-government and who would turn in the direction of a strong man or some other form of government. So he diagnoses this problem and then he prescribes a solution.
Right, and of course he would be horrified, Diana, to see the looting and the burning that was associated with in the cities and the lack of action on law enforcement. And then, of course, the invasion of our capital with forces that were violent and all identifying with this mob rule mentality. I mean, what do you think he would think of that?
I think that's right. I think that Lincoln would be equally horrified at both extremes. And in fact, in his own day, politics was doing this also. The divides, the chasms were becoming greater. Extremism was emerging on both sides of the slavery question. And he, even though he agrees with the aim of the abolitionists in bringing about eventually the end of slavery, he really did object to their extremism and the extremism of their rhetoric, their hostility to the Constitution, and of course he's very opposed to the growing extremism of the Southerners, the secessionists, the slavocrats. I don't think we are actually headed towards civil war, but there are certain similarities between his period and our period. And it's why, when students read the Lyceum Address, they're just, astonished at his prescience and at its relevance.
Right, Diana, I just want to touch on the preface for a moment, and you make some very interesting statements. Number one is Lincoln's downplaying of the usage of words, promoting action, but it seems as though his words were very, very successful in bringing about that action. And he used the reference in the Gettysburg Address of the fact that work was still needed to be done to vilify the reason. Of course, we'll talk about that when we get to the Gettysburg Address. But I also thought it was interesting, Diana, that you say, quote, "My conviction is that Lincoln's greatest speeches matter as intensely today as when first delivered."
I think that's right, because he does deliver this really timeless diagnosis of the dangers to which the project of self-government is prone. I think his solutions are still the ones that we need. In the Lyceum Address, he calls for reverence for the Constitution and laws. He believes that all political change and political correction of whatever the problems are that exist, that has to be done through the lawful procedures of democratic government.
Mhm.
His call for, education of the people, for literacy, the need to have a people who can recognize these threats, the threats of demagoguery and kind of overweening ambition on the part of the few. So
Right. And
yeah, I mean,
also,
yeah, go ahead.
no, go ahead. Expand, please.
Well, I was just going to say something on your opening point there about words. Yes, in the preface, I do say that, as a statesman, the most important thing the statesman has to do is to choose well in the moment. And we see plenty of instances of Lincoln doing that. So action really does matter. But I try to make the case that Lincoln's words become almost a form of action, or he uses words in order to motivate that citizen action, to enlighten the public so that they can make the right choices.
Right. In our organization, the Constitutional Republicans, Diana, we firmly believe that his words are as relevant today as when he spoke them. And we believe that we need to restore those words and those ideals. For example, the Republican Party needs to readopt the principles of the Declaration of Independence, which of course he said in Peoria even before the Republican Party was established. But that's exactly what the Republican Party needs to do. And we talk about this all the time with the people who are joining our organization and who are attempting to educate. But we also want to restore the initial principles of the Republican Party. And all we have to do is go back to what Lincoln said in readopting the Declaration of Independence as our guide.
Yeah, I think that's right. When you read Lincoln, he takes us back to the founding always. And he anchors his own understanding and policies in the thought of the founding, and especially, as you just mentioned, in the Declaration of Independence. And so I think we can get to that same place through Lincoln. Right?
Yes.
When we read Lincoln, then he in turn
We
brings
believe.
us back to the founding. So I think in a way that Lincoln is our best guide to the thought of the founding. Better in some ways than the founders themselves. As you know, when people read Jefferson, there are lots of reasons to take exception to certain elements of Jefferson's behavior and character. So really, by going through Lincoln, I think we get to the ideas in their purer form.
No question. And also in the chapter, Diana, you talk about another great mentor of ours. Actually, you talk about two specifically mentors of ours. Number one being the great Daniel Webster, the great orator and great constitutional lawyer, and the great Whig who obviously would have had a great influence, though I don't think we know much about Lincoln's writings on Webster. But what's interesting is in the chapter, you talk about their remarks concerning generational obligations. Talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, I think that Lincoln is very familiar with Webster. He would have been very familiar with Webster's second reply to Hayne, that great demolition that Webster does of the nullification argument, which will eventually become the secessionist argument. But he would have been familiar with speeches like the Webster speech at Bunker Hill, one of these great sort of celebratory July 4th sorts of addresses. And Webster there really addresses this question of what are the tasks that are left to his own generation. He's not part of that founding generation. What's left for the next generation to do? And I think Webster turns in the direction of, well, you can see it in the Whig program of internal improvements. We're going to improve sort of, our material prosperity and the infrastructure of the nation. And that will be this great task for us ahead. And Lincoln certainly is a Whig, right? Especially in 1838, he is a Whig, and he's on board with that program of internal improvements. But I think that in the Lyceum Address, Lincoln really deepens the reflection on internal improvements. And he says, actually, what we've really got to improve are our own souls. And we have to improve our character as a people. So in this, I think that that Lincoln goes back really to George Washington and Washington's farewell address. So in, Washington's farewell address is probably our most well-known speech of warning. It's a speech that Washington gives as he leaves the scene, giving up, relinquishing political power, but he wants to warn Americans of the dangers that he sees ahead. And Lincoln's Lyceum address is given at the very beginning of his political career, but he's in a way taking, that ball from Washington and picking up on that theme of warning. And I think he actually deepens Washington's concerns about the threats ahead, and really focuses on those internal dangers, the dangers that arise from the passions of the people and what happens when those passions go awry.
Outstanding. And we're moving chronologically through the chapter. You beautifully brought up Washington. I was going to talk about the subtitle of George Washington and our political institutions. And Diana, discuss the similarities and contrast between Washington's farewell and Lincoln's Lyceum address, but especially how Lincoln describes how mob rule displaces each one of the three branches of government.
Yeah, that's you can see in just one sentence from Lincoln how careful his analysis is. So he says about these mobs, what is it that happens? Well, he says they're displacing what the legislature does, right? In place of the laws passed by the legislature, mobs just do what they like, what they will. They substitute their passions for this sort of ordered thought that you get in legislation. And then he says they are also circumventing what the courts of justice do. Instead of due process of law and all of those procedures, mobs just decide that someone is guilty, and they lynch people and burn them, tie them into a tree and burn them. Again, just on the basis of their own whim and judgment. And then he says also then that this is subverting the executive branch. It's subverting what police are supposed to do in apprehending criminals. So just in one sentence, just through these little phrases, he shows how what's called mob rule is in fact not rule at all. It is the overturning of all of the procedures of law as carried out by the three branches of government.
No question. And also, Diana, I wanted you to speak to the idea and the words that you use, quote, of the democratic complacency under another important personality by the name of President Martin Van Buren, of course, who was heir apparent to none other than Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson.
Yes.
So tie in the dichotomy that would exist between this democratic complacency and the urgency of Lincoln's speech on the perpetuity of institutions.
Yeah, so this is, I think, interesting. The occasion for this speech by Lincoln, he's speaking to the Young Men's Lyceum. So this is like a self-improvement association for young men in Springfield, Illinois. So when you receive an invitation like this to deliver a lecture, it was not supposed to be an explicitly partisan lecture. So, Lincoln pulls back from any sort of partisanship, but I think he is still in conversation with the Democratic Party that he is opposed to. He's a Whig. So from the Whig perspective, what's happening in America is, the despotism of Jackson is now being carried on by Van Buren's, by the newly elected Van Buren. And Van Buren, in his first inaugural, had also referred to these outbreaks of mob violence. But Van Buren tended to downplay that. He didn't think there was any permanent threat to the system from those actions. And he suggested that if there was any problem, it could be solved by the abolitionists shutting up. In other words, he
Yeah.
blamed these outbreaks of violence on the abolitionists. And he says we need to be, Van Buren's version of going back to the founders is that we should all just be more careful of the sensibilities of the slaveholders and not say anything that might agitate them. So Van Buren, in a way, was recommending a kind of speech code, a kind of self-censorship on the part of Americans. And Van Buren claimed that we should do this out of fraternal feeling. So Lincoln believed that this was a misuse of the appeal to fraternal feeling. And at the same time, that what Van Buren had said represented a kind of democratic complacency that, you know, all will just be well if we make this little adjustment. So I think Lincoln thought that the problems were much more serious and pervasive. And he didn't think that those problems could just be covered over. Lincoln believed that the only way to address this was through civil discourse. So he wanted to show Americans that there was a way to have these difficult moral discussions, and to do so at the level of principle rather than at the level of partisanship. So I think that in the Lyceum Address, he really is trying to figure out how to open up some space, a space within which Americans can start to talk about slavery.
Fascinating. And also there is a subtitle, Diana, called Disobedience, always uncivil or sometimes civil. And this is a really very, very interesting chapter. And we're not going to discuss it, but I will say that what you're doing is comparing the ideas and thoughts of Lincoln as opposed to in dichotomy to Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. So you're going to want to buy this book, his greatest speeches, How Lincoln Turned the Nation. And there it is. We're discussing it right now with the author, Dr. Diana Schaub. So that's a fascinating subtitle and portion of the Lyceum Address, Diana. I encourage everyone to read that, and you'll get some great ideas that you probably have never thought about. Now, as we come to the conclusion of the Lyceum, let's discuss the word that really is the antithesis of what Washington, the founders and the Federalist Papers, and Lincoln especially said that we must guard against, that we see all too prevalent today in our society and in our political situation. And that is the word passion. And I want you to tell us, number one, and very interestingly in the book, you talk about passion is usually the word that all of those giving graduation speeches are imploring the children, fulfill your passion, fulfill your desire, execute your passion. But yet that word was very, very different to Abraham Lincoln, was it not?
Yeah, I think so. At the very end of the Lyceum Address, he actually says passion is our enemy. In the past, passion may have helped us. He acknowledges the role that the passions played during the Revolution. You know, you could take passions like hatred and revenge, and you could turn that against the British, and their passion could serve the cause of self-government. But Lincoln says that now and in the future, passion is going to be our enemy. Now, I do think he has something very specific in mind with this word passion. He defines it pretty carefully. He always uses passion to mean the negative passions. And so he gives examples like hatred, revenge, envy, jealousy, greed. Always passion means something negative. So passion does not mean things like the bonds of affection among Americans. It doesn't mean patriotism. It doesn't mean those things that we might call passions, but he does not call those passions. So he sort of makes a distinction between passion, always negative, and feeling and sentiment, which can have a positive valence. So yeah, he is trying to figure out what to do about these permanent human tendencies and passions. that once independence is achieved, he's worried that those negative passions will be turned against one's fellow Americans. So he's worried about divisiveness and hyperpartisanship and the same kinds of things that we talk about today.
And also under the subtitle Sober Reason, Lincoln gives us the very prescription for what needs to be reinstituted today, and which our organization and which you do as a professor and educating. Number one begins with the general intelligence of our citizens, and then sound morality, of course, which we talk about. The Republican Party was based on moral principles like ending the atrocity and injustice of slavery. We once again must take up that same responsibility. And then finally, in particular, reverence for the Constitution and laws, which is what we talk about all the time, the Constitution, its structure, and re-establishing, Diana, its preeminence in government. We've seen with the COVID-19 lockdowns, the suspension of constitutional rights, of First Amendment rights, of freedom of assembly, religious expression, and in New Jersey, the right for a person to make a living. So without the general knowledge or the general intelligence to know what the Constitution says, incorporating sound morality, and then reverence for the Constitution and laws, there's the prescription, is it not?
Yep, that's right. And he actually says that all three of those things are somehow linked to reason, or that's
Yes.
the form that reason takes. So it's clear enough to see how reason can take the form of general intelligence, but he also links reason to sound morality. In other words, he seems to argue that there is a rational basis, right, for morality. And then maybe most interesting, he seems to argue that reverence is itself a consequence of reason, or a kind of instantiation of reason. So he actually links reason and reverence together.
And then finally, with the subtitle entitled The Paean to Washington, or the Song to Washington, rather. And I find it remarkable, Diana, that it almost seems like the ending paragraphs come out of nowhere. I mean, after giving us the idea of general intelligence and sound morality and reverence for the Constitution and laws, then he goes to Washington and makes this almost prophetical, and it brings about the idea of the resurrection. And talk about how he ended this speech. It's fascinating.
Yeah, you're right. It is a piece of very high-flown rhetoric. It's as if he is trying to show what that reverence might look like by talking about our reverence for Washington. So yeah, he envisions basically, what happens at the end times, when Washington will, be raised from the grave, and Washington will then be able to see how his fellow Americans performed. How did subsequent generations perform? And he says, will he see that we remained free to the last, that we improved to the last, and that we, didn't permit any hostile foot to desecrate the grave of Washington. So it is a remarkable piece of very high-flown rhetoric. It's actually very characteristic of all of his speeches before the presidential speeches. He often ends his speeches with this kind of prayer to Washington, or an invocation of the person of George Washington. Interestingly, that stops once he is elevated to the presidency, and in that Springfield farewell, he says, I now, leave Springfield, not knowing when or ever I will return, with a task upon me greater than that Washington faced. So I think really from that point forward, the appeal to Washington, he knows, is not sufficient. The country is in a new place, facing a new threat, and higher appeals actually will be necessary. And from that point forward, his ending appeal is usually to God.
That's correct. And before we move on to the Gettysburg Address, Diane, I wanted you to explain for the audience. Of course, Lincoln was a great, he studied logic and he studied rhetoric. And the word rhetoric, now we have a totally different understanding and application of the word rhetoric than what the classicists and what Lincoln would have had. And what is that difference?
Yeah, I think there may be two ways that we use rhetoric today. Sometimes it means just something empty, a rhetorical question, which is like a question you're not supposed to answer. It's just rhetorical. It's just for show.
Right.
And then maybe the more pernicious use is that, we think of rhetoric as sophistry. It's just the spin doctors and the manipulators, right, at work. And this kind of duality of rhetoric has been present from the beginnings, from Greek times. They were aware of the way in which language could be misused, used for illegitimate purposes, used to propagate lies, used to make the weaker argument appear to be the stronger argument. That's what a sophist does. But the Greeks also had a notion of rhetoric as a noble art, and used properly, it is the art of leading souls to the good. So the rhetor, properly understood, is the good man working for the good of the political community. And I think this is what Lincoln is, and the way in which he tries to use words. He also believes that essential to that rhetoric, to that art of democratic persuasion, is friendship. I think the place to look to really see his theory of rhetoric is the Temperance Speech. This is given just a few years after the Lyceum Address. It's 1842. And there he explains that if you're really going to convince anybody that that your cause is the right one, you have to first befriend them. That friendship is really the great high road to reason. And the alternative approach is just to denounce people and use harsh language, use denunciation and vituperation. And Lincoln rejects that. And in a way, the Temperance Address is a kind of criticism, I think, of the abolitionists. He agrees with them about their understanding of the wrongness and evil of slavery, but he thinks they're taking the wrong route rhetorically.
I'm so glad you mentioned the Lincoln's desire to befriend the person who he's trying to convince. And of course, he talked about the importance of public sentiment and leading and teaching the public sentiment. And I think it's very clear, Diane, that we haven't had a president with that mentality since Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was liked by the Democrats. Tip O'Neill, his arch enemy, loved Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan had the ability to charm, and he was a gentleman, and he didn't talk at someone, he talked to them. And even Sam Donaldson and some of the media at that time, they grew to love Ronald Reagan. And that's really what we need from an executive. And Lincoln understood that clearly. And we'll talk about it with the second inaugural, the words that he puts there and the sentiments that he. But as we move to the Gettysburg Address, and thank you for clarifying the word rhetoric in its original meaning, because I talk about that word a lot. I'm trying to convince people that we need to get educated, that we need to go back to the Declaration, we need to revere the Constitution, all these things Lincoln says. And they're all examples of rhetoric. But I wanted to talk about now the Gettysburg Address. And just an aside, if you will, my father was born on November 19th. And he just had his 94th birthday. And of course, he has always been a great reverer of Lincoln, but we always say that my dad was born on Gettysburg Address Day. And Carmen was born on Gettysburg Address Day. So it's always been revered to us. And it was even, in his generation, the children were taught to memorize the text, and they knew it verbatim. But I wanted to begin this Gettysburg Address part with July 7th of 1863. which was only 3 days after what happened at the Battle of Gettysburg. And Lincoln makes these extemporaneous remarks at the White House about the good news from Gettysburg just a couple of days after the battle precipitated, with an address that seems to have been the precursor to the Gettysburg Address. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's right. Now, this was a spontaneous speech. It's called a Serenade Address, where people sort of come to serenade the president to celebrate the victory at Gettysburg, and of course also the siege at Vicksburg. Confederates had just surrendered there. So there was a lot to celebrate. And he made these extemporaneous remarks. We know that Lincoln didn't like to do this. He much preferred to work from a prepared speech. But yeah, you do see I think the kernel of what he will, then do at Gettysburg. But there are some real differences between the July 7th address and Gettysburg. So in the July 7th one, he makes the link to the founding. He talks about the fact that Jefferson and Adams died on the same day on July 4th, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration. He's very specific about, this was a victory, just a little north of here in Pennsylvania. He kind of names names. It's a very concrete reflection on the importance of that battle. And he ends it by saying, this is deserving of a speech, but I'm not prepared to give it today.
Right.
And then a few months later, he is ready with the speech. And in the meantime, I believe he has really transmuted those materials, and he has made them, for one thing, much more abstract. I mean, it is really remarkable that the Gettysburg Address doesn't mention Gettysburg. It doesn't mention the Union, doesn't mention the Confederates. It's written at this tremendous level of abstraction.
No question. And I think it's very interesting, Diana, that you bring out in this chapter the very first words, which we all are very familiar with, being 7 years ago. And that was very, very relevant, that type of language, to the people and to the middle-class Protestants who read the King James Bible. That was the book, that was their major source of education in many ways. But in Psalm 90:10, we read that the days of our years are 80 years and 10, meaning 80 is generally the average, and by reason of strength, if they be 80 years, getting to 80, yet it is their strength, labor, and sorrow, for it is soon caught off, and we fly away, unquote. So what I think is brilliant that you brought out in the book is the fact that the audience would have understood this limitation placed upon mortal life. And then linking, talking about how this free government may have a shorter or a lifespan that is very similar to that which the Bible, that which God gives application to a human being. And that would have been very profound in their thinking as they hear him start this address using this language that they read of in the King James to talk about the length of human life, and then associating that with the length of perhaps our nation if those who are defending free government didn't win the war.
Yeah, that's right. If you do the math, he's talking about 1776. But we might ask, right, well, why didn't he just say in 1776? But I think that the emotional valence is very different. If you say in 1776, well, then that just conjures up, the Revolutionary War and, this great battle and, our victory, the eventual successful founding of the nation. But if you say 7 years ago, yeah, the audience would have been aware that this is a biblical way of counting. And as you say, they would have been aware that this is linked to a reflection on mortality. So this is a much more somber way of speaking. And it forces forward the question, all right, we know that the life of man is 70 and 10, or at most 80. but what about the life of a nation? We are already beyond the expected lifespan of a human being, right? At 87, we are beyond even the longest lived human beings who might make it to 80.
Right.
And so he is really tying together that individual mortality and the question of the nation's mortality. And that's why he then presents what's happening in the second paragraph as a test, right? A test of whether a nation, whether this particular nation, so conceived and so founded, conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition of human equality, whether that nation can survive, and whether any nation so conceived and so dedicated can survive. So in other words, the Civil War is a test of popular government altogether. Right? Is this project doable? Is it sustainable? So he is really still with the same themes that he had in the Lyceum Address, that theme of perpetuation and the theme of generational responsibility.
And it's remarkable, Diana, the usage of biblical language throughout this notorious speech, the ideas of being conceived in liberty, the ideas of a new birth, which harken back to John 3:3, a new birth of freedom for the country. And then, of course, under God, all of this occurring under God's providence. Of course, Lincoln's education as a youth, he was educated in many of the ideas of the sovereignty of God, which many people may refer to as Calvinism. And this clearly is evident in these remarks in the Gettysburg Address.
Yeah, I think that's right. That phrase "under God" is understood to be a late addition to the speech. It doesn't occur in every edition that we have. But it's also very clear from the journalistic reports of the time that he did say that. All of the journalistic reports have that phrase "under God," and when Lincoln did a final copy of the Gettysburg Address, that phrase is in there. So I do think this is linked to his understanding of democratic government, that democratic government means that we are bound by majority decisions. But Lincoln doesn't believe that the voice of the people is the voice of God. In other words, democratic peoples have to recognize that there are certain limits upon what they can do with their majority power. They have to be aware of the reciprocal rights of all other human beings. And I do think he is, in a way, linking that insight somehow to God's sovereignty.
I wanted to ask you this question, Diana, and that is in the middle of 1862, the Union, with great material advantage, George McClellan comes in and organizes this Army of the Potomac, but yet they get beat. His Peninsula campaign, McClellan's Peninsula campaign, is a total disaster. And then a terrible loss with a man who Lincoln brought in, who was an ardent abolitionist, a fellow Illinois, John Pope, and the terrible loss at the Second Battle of Bull Run. Of course, the Confederates, or the insurgents, will call it Manassas. But what's amazing, and what I wanted to ask you is that if you thought Lincoln was contemplating the Emancipation Proclamation, right? And it was, he wanted to instill it not only for political reasons, but don't you think that he was thinking that, and we could see this with the Gettysburg and especially the second inaugural, that because the Union was getting beat battle after battle, that perhaps he knew that the resolve had to turn towards actual emancipation and ending slavery, which he tried to be very diplomatic about, very constitutional about, if you will.
Yeah.
Do you think that had any? Do you think that had any room in his thoughts prior to Antietam, prior to when John or Secretary Seward said, "Let's win a battle before we emancipate"? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the abolitionists have, from the beginning of the war, been urging emancipation. They wanted to immediately turn the war for the Union into a war to end slavery. Lincoln resists that for 18 months. He doesn't initially believe that he has the authority simply to act on his personal wish that all men everywhere might be free. He's bound by the oath that he's taken. So he does not come to emancipation, I think, until he truly believes that it is militarily warranted.
Mhm.
So, if you look at the way in which both the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation is written and then the final Emancipation Proclamation, he makes very clear that he is taking this action in his role as commander in chief of the military in time of actual, rebellion, uh, rebellion that is endangering the country. So he justifies the action on grounds of military necessity. And I
Mhm.
think he is sincere in not taking the action until he believes that the military necessity is present. So, it is the declining Northern morale and these losses and so on that eventually make possible emancipation. So I think he always preserves the priority of union over emancipation. And
Mhm.
his task as president is to maintain the union. He
Mhm.
only acts against slavery when it becomes the only way to maintain the union. So eventually those two causes are conjoined, union and
Mhm.
abolition. And that
Mhm.
happens with the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Gettysburg Address, I think, does acknowledge. Gettysburg Address is delivered, almost a year after the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. So the arrival of Black troops, in the Union forces is beginning to make itself felt. So that is part of what Lincoln means in speaking about the new birth of freedom. Um, he's already looking forward to what that will mean about what new foundation will the nation go forward? How can we move towards full equality?
Another great point that you make in the Gettysburg Address chapter is the word "we" and the number of times that it's used.
Yeah, 10 times more than any other word in the speech. Yeah. Yeah, and of course he
And of
uses
course,
I, not at all. So again, there's a
amazing.
very characteristic, especially of his presidential speech. There's this suppression of the self, which is
Mhm.
very visible both in the Gettysburg Address and in the second inaugural. And yeah, clearly in the Gettysburg Address, what what comes to prominence is we. Yeah.
What's amazing too, Diana, and you discuss this, is the fact that many people don't understand this or know this. And that's the fact that the we isn't all inclusive when he mentions for those who gave their lives,
Yeah.
that the nation might live, or that the brave men living and dead who struggled there, the honored dead, which gave their last full measure of devotion, these dead having not died in vain. They were exclusive references to the Union soldiers.
That's right.
Many of them were volunteers, or the loyal dead rather than the disloyal dead, I like to say. And but yet
Yeah, I think
that seems to have been, they've all been joined.
Yeah, I think sometimes students don't realize this because they're so aware of Lincoln's, deserved reputation as, the person who says, with malice towards none, with charity for all. They believe
Right.
that he's already, trying to put the sides back together. But actually, the Gettysburg Address is a war speech. He is trying to muster Union morale to see the war through. He is
Mhm.
calling for further victories on the field of battle. And the cemetery which is being dedicated is a cemetery to the Union dead. And in fact, the people
Yes.
of Gettysburg have spent the last few months actually digging up the bodies that were hastily buried after the the midsummer battle, and sorting those bodies into, separating out the Confederate dead from the Union dead, and the Confederate dead were simply reburied where they fell without coffins, just dug deeper into the ground. They were not recovered until much later by the once the Confederate States had fully come back into the Union. So this was a Union cemetery celebrating the honored dead. But it is very significant, I think, that it's a war speech, but it's not a speech that demonizes the enemy. This is a civil war. So in that sense, Lincoln is looking forward to how do you put the parties or the sides back together. And so he doesn't want to say anything that will imperil that reunification. So the Confederate dead are sort of present only by implication, when he says things like, we're here to celebrate the honored dead. Everybody's aware, well, there are also the dishonored or the dishonorable dead.
That's right. And then he gives the responsibility to those who are living, who are there, that they would increase their devotion, and that they would also realize that those who died did not die in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. So he's ending it by telling everyone, we have work to do. We still have the road before us. And it's truly remarkable how humble he is, how he's not trying to infuriate or instigate any further Confederate angst. And then he really proves it with the second inauguration, which is what we'll tie into now.
Yeah.
But
Can I one further comment just about Gettysburg Address and that the message to the living? In a certain sense, Lincoln doesn't do what he was asked to do. He was asked to say some appropriate words dedicating the cemetery. Right. But Lincoln wants to honor the dead, but he doesn't want the folks who are there just to give way to their grief. That grief could really imperil the war effort. And so he has to turn their energies, right, away from that grief and towards victory. And so that's why he pivots really from the dead to the living. His message is really to the living and what their task is. And so their task has to be to, dedicate themselves and rededicate themselves in the way that the dead have already done.
That's great. And also our great friend, Dr. Alan Gelzo, gave us a lesson on why we remember the Gettysburg Address at Washington and Lee, with Dr. Morrell hosting. And it was very profound. I believe it was in 2017, but Dr. Gelzo, this speech can be seen on YouTube. We actually posted up every Gettysburg or November 19th, but Dr. Gelzo makes reference that we today, the citizens of today, those living today, need to take on the same admonition that Lincoln is giving those who were there that day and reapply it in preserving our republic. And this ties into what Reagan said about it's every 20 years. The ideas of free institutions and free government, they have to be worked for, they have to be educated, they have to be adhered to. And I really thought it was profound that Dr. Gelzo, our friend, tied that idea into us today, and why the Gettysburg Address truly is perpetual, year after year. Let's move on.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Where do you want us to go in the second inaugural? There's a lot there. So
well, the second inaugural, there's a lot there, correct? But let's start off with the pronoun they. He never used it. He only used the word all. And talk about how he put all that together with the ultimate demos, the ultimate democratic word.
Yeah. So he. The second inaugural is a kind of an account of the outbreak of the war and the two parties, the two sides to that conflict. And he moves from there to an exploration of the cause, the deeper cause of the war. And then eventually to an interpretation of the meaning of the war, a meaning that he really attributes to God's providence and God's punishment of the nation for the sin of American slavery. But this is also, I mean, if the Gettysburg Address is his war speech, the second inaugural is his peace speech. So how do you talk about the outbreak of the war and the cause of the war without further, pulling the sides apart, without triggering the hostilities that started the war? So he has to find the language in which to do this. And I think part of the way in which he does it is not to use pronouns here like we and they. If you're speaking of we, there might be an implied they. And that was true in the Gettysburg Address. But he doesn't want to use that language in the second inaugural. And so instead, he uses these indefinite pronouns. So he speaks about each and both, without being too specific about it. And he does that, I think, so that he can eventually get to the all. He's trying to figure out how to put the all back together again. And so if you actually trace the usage of the word all, and in the second inaugural, all is the most frequently used word. It's used 10 times, just as we was used 10 times in the Gettysburg Address. So in the beginning, all seems to refer, well, actually does refer to just those who are present there for the delivery of the second inaugural. Refers to all of those who take heart from the way the military situation is going in March of 1865. All there means the Unionists. But as the speech unfolds, he expands that category of the all and who is included within the all, so that by the second paragraph, all applies to both Northerners and Southerners. All dreaded the war. No one wanted it. There were certain similarities, right, between North and South. There were no warmongers, Lincoln says. Right, all dreaded the war. All sought to avoid it. And then in the third paragraph, all expands even more to include the slaves. Lincoln now talks about the 1/8 of the population who were enslaved, and he now includes them within the all. So the all keeps expanding, so that by the very end of the speech, right, when you hear, with malice towards none, with charity for all. And then the very last words where he says, we want peace not only among ourselves, but with all nations, right? All expands even further. It becomes a kind of global term. So it really is a remarkable unfolding and development.
And also in the book, Diana, which you brilliantly include, is the historical precedent Lincoln applies to the word all. In the Dred Scott speech, the authors of the Declaration meant to set up a standard maximum for free society, which could be familiar to all and revered by all. And then, and we talk about this all the time, yet never perfectly attained, yet we're still aspiring to bring about this idea of the self-evident truth that all men are created equal, the laws of nature and nature's God, so forth, and then deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere, which was a remarkable speech that he would have given. And then all honor to Jefferson, another time in talking about Jefferson's great influence. And then right within our logo, Diana, we have his speech on the fragment of the Constitution saying liberty to all.
Yeah.
So and this is a word that the Republican Party needs to restore. We represent all the people. The Democrats are very sectarian. They've been that historically, but Republicans can promote a message that incorporates all and gives liberty to all. And I really appreciate that segment of the chapter that you talk about this word all and how
Yeah,
important it is and how
I talk about it not only in the second inaugural, but you're right. I give a kind of sampler of Lincoln's usage of
Yes,
this word all, because he's been using it
brilliant.
in that way throughout those speeches from the 1850s. And it was great that you read aloud that passage from the Dred Scott speech. That is Lincoln's longest, I think, explication of what that equality principle means. It's a wonderful passage from the Dred Scott Address.
It really is, and I'm really glad that you added those examples of the word all, and that's something that we need to restore within the party. I also thought it was very interesting that you bring out and you emphasize the fact that Lincoln was generalizing the blame for slavery to the entire nation, not only the South, but also the North.
Yeah, that's right. So I think Lincoln is very aware of the obstacles to Reconstruction. And one of those obstacles is going to be the moral arrogance of the Northerners, of those who have been victorious. He's worried about the tendency to, the desire to, hold the Southern traders responsible for the terrible suffering of the war. And so I think that's part of the purpose of that theological explanation of the war that he delivers. He lets those Northerners know that they are complicit also, that slavery is not African slavery, it's not Southern slavery, it is American slavery. So he wants the nation as a whole to acknowledge that historic wrong. Yeah, so I think much of that message is delivered to his fellow Unionists, but he's also trying to address the obstacles that will stem from the former Confederates. He knows they are going to be very recalcitrant. They are not going to want to, even if slavery is at an end, he knows that it doesn't mean that racism is going to be at an end. And so he's, I think, in a way, trying to make the Southerners more willing to admit to the wrong of slavery by, in a way, leading the way, by having the Northerners assume their share of that blame. Trying to get both sides to agree that this was American slavery. And then it's also, I think, a message to African Americans. This is an official acknowledgement by the President of the United States, speaking in an inaugural address, of the sin of American slavery. So that he is really addressing all of the parties that will need to come together after the war, whites both North and South, and the freedmen, the newly freed slaves.
It's truly remarkable, Diana, how Abraham Lincoln did everything he could not to encourage or to create more tension or more hatred. And he doesn't use the word Confederate. He uses the word insurgent agents.
Yeah.
So he goes to great lengths not to continue on the hatred. And it's truly remarkable how humble he was in that regard, and how he didn't want to incite more hatred by using words like Confederates. He didn't believe in the Confederacy from the very beginning. He said that they were.
He always called it the so-called Confederacy. I think this is actually something that he maybe learns from George Washington. When Washington dealt with mutinies, mutinies within the army or the Whiskey Rebellion when he was president, Washington always sort of singled out the ringleaders and was willing to punish them. And I think Lincoln is doing something like that when he talks about insurgent agents. He's in a way allowing the Southerners to say, if they want to, yeah, it really wasn't our idea. We weren't completely on board with that. There were those insurgent agents. He's blaming the few rather than the many.
Mhm. And what's amazing too, Diana, is that the proponents of the lost cause efforts, which have lasted really since a couple of decades after the assassination of Lincoln. But what's remarkable, and in the speech, Lincoln says that these slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest, and all knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. The Lost Cause talks about states' rights, but all of their declarations of separation or secession all spoke of how slavery was the predominant interest. And Alexander Stephens went so far to call it the cornerstone of the Confederacy.
Yeah.
But yet Lincoln.
I think
No, go ahead.
Lincoln says that in the second inaugural, I think that would have been, no one would have challenged that. Everyone would have agreed with that statement, that all knew somehow that slavery was the cause of the war. So yeah, it is a kind of twisting of history that takes hold, within even the historical profession for a very long time. I think that the tide on that really has turned. I think if you read all of the noted historians today, there is an acknowledgement that what was really going on was slavery. Yeah, so you talk about states' rights, but it's the right to do what? It's the right to hold slaves.
Yeah, exactly. And what's amazing is too, Diana, is then he moves into what I would consider one of the greatest sermons ever given, and incorporating everyone. It reminds me of the verses that say there is none that doeth good, there's none that seeketh after God. I believe it's Romans 3:10. But he says that we all pray to the same God, we all read the same Bible, we're all asking for God's approval, and yet all of us have failed in that respect, and that the judgments of God are altogether righteous. And then talking about the fact that woe unto him who sins may come or are perpetuated by. What a tremendous, it must have made a tremendous impact on all who heard it, even those who were fighting against him.
Yeah, I think it's clear that Lincoln thought the second inaugural was his greatest speech. And would be the speech that lasted the longest. He says that in a letter written just a few days after the address. But he also says that he doesn't think that the speech was immediately popular. And he says people don't like to be told that there was a difference between themselves and God. And in a way, that's what he was telling Americans, right? They all read the same Bible and prayed to the same God, but they didn't get it right. None of them got it right. Lincoln says that the Almighty has his own purposes. And so Lincoln is trying to encourage that kind of humility. So I think it's very important to look at the way in which he uses religion. So he certainly is using religion in this speech, and some people might be made today, especially, might be made uncomfortable by that. Doesn't this cross some kind of line between church and state, or between religion and politics? But I think it's very important to note that Lincoln is invoking this religious language in order to encourage humility on the part of human beings. So he's not using it to encourage some kind of fanaticism or some belief that, I know what God says and I'm the agent of God and the instrument of God. He's using religion in a very different way. He's also very careful to say that the interpretation that he puts forward is a hypothesis. It's a supposition. He doesn't say he knows it to be true, but he says, if we shall suppose that, and then there's that long sentence. So I think he's very careful in his presentation of this interpretation. But he is hoping that a religious people, a Christian people, will be inclined to accept this understanding of the meaning of the war, and that if they do accept that understanding, that will provide a better basis going forward for human charity. So again, just as in the Lyceum Address, he was trying to clear a space for discussion of the issue of slavery. I think what he's trying to do in the second inaugural is clear a space for the exercise of human charity, because that is going to be necessary if the wounds of the war are going to be repaired.
Right, and two subjects that you bring out beautifully in this chapter, Diana. Number one, his invocation of a living God, and you give references, biblical reference to that. Him speaking of a living God, and then also the fact that he said, "Yet if God wills," and there we get his idea that he probably understood as a child in that Calvinistic Baptist church in Indiana, or it may have been in later on in Illinois. But he says, "Yet if God wills that the battle continue until the wealth piled up by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, until every drop of blood drawn from the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword." And you bring out the fact that 1619 is a very, very real date, historical date, and that Lincoln is making reference to that right here at the end of the second inaugural. That's three very, very important points: God's sovereignty, the living God, and also 1619.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So the God that he brings forward in the second inaugural is, I mean, it doesn't say it's explicitly the Christian God, but it is a God who is active in history, a providential God, a living God, not a deistic clockmaker kind of God. This is a God who punishes and who holds human beings responsible for wrongdoing. And then that sentence, which I sort of call the divine reparations sentence, where he envisions what justice might look like if God holds us fully responsible, right, for all of the wealth stolen from the slaves and all of the blood drawn with the lash. Yeah, that date, if you again do the math, 250 years from 1865 takes you back to 1615. So I think he's kind of rounded it off. But yes, he has in mind that origin date of American slavery on the North American continent. So yeah, he's holding the nation responsible for a wrong that predates the founding of the nation by 150 years. Right? That American slavery began a very, very long time ago, but we have in a way inherited that debt and are still responsible for it. But I think he's also indicating in that sentence that, in fact, God has been merciful to the nation because the war is just about over. And I think Lincoln suggests that we really haven't paid the full blood price. Right? There hasn't been drop for drop blood yet. Not every drop of blood drawn by the lash has been repaid by another drawn with the sword. The war could, if God wanted it to, the war could continue until that justice was executed. But I think what Lincoln means to imply is that in fact God has been merciful to us. And that becomes then a kind of model for human mercy as well. As God has been merciful to us, we should be merciful to one another. So that he is pointing the nation towards both sectional reconciliation and racial reconciliation. And he knows, in fact, that it's very difficult to put those two forms of reconciliation together. There's a danger that the sections will reconcile, but they will do so at the price of justice to the formerly enslaved. So it's very difficult to figure out how you are going to get both sectional reconciliation and racial reconciliation.
And of course, with his the monumentous words of "with malice toward none, with charity for all." So there he is laying out the idea behind Reconstruction. And this flew in the face with many of his own in his party, who would later, after his assassination, men like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, this flew completely in the face of the radical Republicans because they wanted revenge. But Lincoln provided that great benevolence that he had and his compassion. And he exuded so many of the attributes of Christ. It's no wonder that no book has been written more about any other man apart from Christ than Abraham Lincoln, because he manifested the fruits of virtue and of benevolence. And those words to me are remarkable, considering 650,000 that were dead, over 1 million that were marred or scarred for life. And he says, with malice towards none and charity for all. Truly remarkable.
Yeah. Yeah, that final paragraph is, is deliverance of the final message. But it is through the third paragraph, the paragraph before that, I think, that enables him to get to that, to
Yes.
make that call. Yeah.
No question about it. And then, of course, and you bring this out in the book, which is so well done. You talk about the words, the 3 words or the 4 words. He says, let us strive on.
Yeah, we can't forget that the actual sentence there is, let us strive on. So the earlier part, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, that describes the manner, right, in which we have to strive. But what he's calling for, just as in Gettysburg, right, is, let us strive on. There is work to be done. There is action that has to be taken.
No question. And as we wrap it up, Diana, I want to thank you so much for joining me tonight. And I want the people to know to please share and like the video so that people can become familiar with Diana and her book, which we just, we could talk about it for a long time, but I want Diana to come back and hopefully she'll know I'm not as long windbagged as I can be. But I want the people to know, Diana, that we just scratched the surface on what the information is on concerning these 3 great speeches. And for the viewer to get this book, to purchase it, you'll really be glad you did, and you'll get so many ideas. And you'll especially get educated on the Lyceum Address, which many people may not be as familiar with. This is Gettysburg and the second inaugural, but you bring out so many great points that even experts or people that have studied Lincoln will garner and mine from this treasure trove of information here.
Great. Thank you so much, JR. I really enjoyed it.
It's great. And I want to have you back. And I just want to finish with asking you that Frederick Douglass, didn't Lincoln go to great, or didn't he search out and look for Frederick Douglass at the second inaugural to get his opinion, that he valued his opinion? And what did Frederick Douglass say?
Yeah, that's right. It's a very wonderful story. Douglass had been present at the delivery of the speech, and then he attended or tried to attend the reception afterwards. And he was initially denied entry and then ejected. Someone ran to Lincoln and said, they're trying to throw Frederick Douglass out, and Lincoln intervened and made sure he was given admittance to the reception. And then as Douglass moved through the receiving line, right, everybody just quickly going past, shaking hands with the president, Lincoln said, tell me what you think of it. And Douglass kind of said, oh, you're busy. I can't take up your time. And Lincoln insisted and said, no, you are the person whose verdict I most want to hear. And Frederick Douglass said, that was a sacred effort, Mr. President. And I do think that's, in a way, the best way into the second inaugural, to think about both of those words, sacred and effort. It's a 2-word description of the speech.
It's a great culmination to our Constitutional Republican conversation, Diana. And currently now you're at Harvard, and what is the course that you're teaching?
Yeah, I'm actually doing my Lincoln course. It's a whole semester on Lincoln, beginning with his boyhood and going all the way up through the second inaugural.
Well, the students that are attending the class are going to get a great education, and I'm sure you're going to be cultivating more Lincolnians, and that's what we need. That's what the Republican Party needs. That's what we need. We need to look back to Lincoln and his example. But thank you so much, Diana. We'll love to have you join us again as we talk about some of these other great Republicans. But thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you all.
And let's remember what Lincoln said, Diana, liberty to all.
Right.
Take care.
Take care.